Have you ever wondered why the history we learn in school always feels incomplete, like someone carefully selected what we should know and what we shouldn't? Today, I'm about to take you on a journey into the untold story of America, facts that shaped the nation, truths hidden under the surface, and moments that changed everything but never made it to your textbooks. And trust me, once you hear this, you'll never look at American history the same way again. So sit back, stay curious, and let's start with something nobody tells you. America didn't become America overnight. It wasn't just the founding fathers signing documents, or brave explorers crossing oceans. It was chaos, survival, ambition, secrets, and strategies, many of which were never taught in school. Most people are taught that America's history begins in 1776, with a declaration, a revolution, and a group of men writing their ideals about freedom and independence. But the truth is far deeper, older, and richer than anything found in school textbooks. To understand the real America, you have to go back thousands of years, long before the first European ships appeared on the horizon, long before borders and colonies, long before the idea of the United States even existed. And when you look back that far, you discover a world completely different from the simplified version of history most of us grew up with. America wasn't an empty land waiting to be discovered. It was already alive, full of thriving civilizations, diverse cultures, advanced systems, and millions of people who had built a connection with the land through centuries of knowledge and experience. These societies didn't exist in isolation. They traded across vast distances, developed farming techniques suited to their environments, understood the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants, and created political structures that were surprisingly sophisticated, sometimes even influencing the democratic ideas Europeans would later claim as their own. Imagine North America not as wilderness, but as a continent buzzing with life. Cities larger than many European capitals existed here. Cahokia, for example, near modern-day Illinois, was a massive urban center with tens of thousands of residents, complex trade networks, and monumental architecture. The people who built it organized festivals, political meetings, markets, and rituals that brought together communities from hundreds of miles away. But when you open a school textbook, you might only find a single line describing this civilization, if it's mentioned at all. And this isn't the only example. The Pueblo people in the Southwest built multi-story homes out of stone and adobe that still stand today. These weren't primitive huts. They were architectural achievements shaped by their understanding of climate, sunlight, wind, and community living. Meanwhile, in the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy developed a political alliance that balanced power among different nations, encouraged debate, and promoted shared decision-making. Some historians believe this confederacy influenced early American democratic structures. Yet this contribution is rarely acknowledged in classrooms. The agricultural knowledge of Native Americans shaped not just America, but the entire world. Corn, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, squash, and dozens of other crops cultivated by indigenous people became global staples. Without them, European diets would have lacked key nutrients, and many populations might not have grown as they did. But students often learn that Europeans introduced agriculture and development, ignoring the fact that advanced farming had been practiced in America for thousands of years. Even the land itself was shaped by indigenous cultivation. Many forests and plains were intentionally maintained through controlled burning to create fertile soil, support plant growth, and ensure healthy wildlife populations. These weren't untouched wildernesses. They were managed ecosystems, curated and improved by people who understood nature in ways few modern societies do. Their understanding of medicine was equally remarkable. Indigenous healers knew which plants could reduce fever, ease pain, heal wounds, or treat infections. Many modern medicines are rooted in this ancient knowledge. Yet in school, we rarely hear about these scientific contributions. Instead, indigenous cultures are often portrayed as simple or undeveloped, a narrative that oversimplifies and diminishes their achievements, and this limited version of history creates a major misunderstanding. It makes it seem like America only becomes important after Europeans arrive, when in reality, the continent had already experienced thousands of years of innovation, adaptation, migration, conflict, cooperation, discovery, and transformation. These early civilizations also had rich spiritual traditions, stories passed down through generations, and moral systems that guided how communities lived together. Their worldviews weren't just beliefs. They were philosophies that shaped their relationships with the land, animals, and each other. Some tribes valued consensus over conflict, sharing over ownership, respect over dominance. These values allowed different nations to coexist across huge territories. And while not all was peaceful, no society in human history has been free of conflict. There was a balance in how communities interacted with their environment. They saw themselves as part of the land, not separate from it. This deeply influenced how they hunted, farmed, built homes, and formed communities. Trade connected regions long before modern borders. Seashells from the Gulf Coast could be found in the Great Lakes. Copper from Michigan traveled as far as the Rocky Mountains. Goods, ideas, stories, and technologies flowed across thousands of miles. Waterways served as trade routes, and footpaths connected distant nations. These exchanges shaped cultures, languages, and alliances. But in school, the narrative often starts with Europeans bringing trade to America, ignoring the vast systems already in place. And that's one of the biggest gaps in traditional education, the assumption that progress is something brought from the outside rather than something that already existed here. Another idea rarely discussed is how deeply indigenous people understood astronomy and the changing seasons. They tracked stars, predicted weather patterns, and timed their farming with precision. Structures aligned with solstices, ceremonies synchronized with celestial events, and knowledge of the skies passed through generations ensured survival and stability. This wasn't accidental. It was science, observation, and experience accumulated over centuries. But classrooms often portray indigenous cultures as mystical rather than scientific, romanticizing their connection to nature instead of respecting it as a form of knowledge. When Europeans finally arrived, they found societies that were organized, complex, and resilient. Yet the interactions that followed were shaped by misunderstanding, fear, ambition, and often exploitation. Disease spread faster than communication, wiping out entire populations before Europeans even reached them. This created the myth that the land was empty or underused, when the truth is that millions had lived, worked, built, and thrived here for generations. The decline of indigenous populations was not a reflection of weakness. It was the tragic result of diseases for which they had no immunity, a biological catastrophe rather than a cultural one. And, as history was later written, many of these realities were softened, ignored, or rewritten to create a simpler narrative, one that made colonization seem inevitable or necessary instead of deeply destructive. By the time American textbooks were created, many of these earlier stories were filtered through political goals, cultural biases, and the desire to create a national identity that appeared unified and heroic. It was easier to start the story in 1776 than to explain the thousands of years before it. It was easier to talk about brave explorers than to acknowledge the sophisticated societies that existed long before they arrived. And it was easier to describe America as a new world than to admit it was already an old world with its own history, achievements, challenges, and transformations. When we look at the full picture, we see that the true beginning of America is much older, richer, and more complex than what most of us were ever taught. When we think about how America rose from scattered colonies to a powerful nation, we usually imagine a simple storyline: brave settlers searching for freedom, hardworking people building towns, and eventually a nation forming through unity and determination. But the real story is far more complicated, and most of it is left out of school textbooks. America's rise wasn't driven only by ideals or dreams. It was shaped by hidden forces, global rivalries, financial motives, massive human movements, and decisions made behind the scenes by people whose names most of us will never hear. To understand the true growth of America, you have to zoom out and look at what was happening in the rest of the world, because the birth and rise of America were deeply tied to the ambitions of global powers competing for influence, wealth, and dominance. When Europeans first came to the continent, it wasn't because they were curious explorers hoping to start new lives. It was because powerful nations like Spain, Britain, and France were locked in a fierce race for global control. Each of these empires wanted more land, more resources, more gold, more trade routes, and more political power. America was not discovered accidentally. It was targeted, explored, and exploited as part of a huge international strategy. Britain didn't colonize the East Coast because it wanted freedom for the settlers. It did it because it wanted to outpower Spain and France economically. France didn't settle the Midwest because they wanted adventure. They wanted control of fur trade networks that stretched across the continent. Spain wasn't sailing the seas because it enjoyed the journey. It wanted to expand its empire and spread its influence worldwide. None of this is taught in school in detail, even though these global rivalries structured every part of early American history. The same thing is true when it comes to the people who lived in the colonies. We're often taught that early Americans came here seeking religious freedom or a new start. While that's true for some, it ignores a much larger truth. Many people came because they were forced by poverty, pushed by governments, trapped by economic pressure, or even sent here as punishment. Britain used America as a place to send criminals, debtors, and people who were seen as burdens. Some were even kidnapped and shipped across the ocean to work as indentured servants. These weren't just workers. They were people caught in a system designed to supply cheap labor for the growing colonies. Meanwhile, many Europeans fled famines, wars, and collapsing systems back home. They came not because America called to them spiritually, but because survival pushed them here. The idea of America being built solely by brave pioneers is comforting, but the truth is that it was built by people who were desperate, oppressed, hopeful, exploited, ambitious, or trying to escape the harsh realities of Europe's economic struggles. And behind these early societies was a massive engine that powered the growing American economy: global trade. America's colonies became valuable not only for their land but for their exports. Tobacco, cotton, sugar, furs, and timber weren't just local resources. They were key products in huge world markets. European empires grew rich from what came out of the colonies, and the colonies grew dependent on what Europe wanted. This back and forth system shaped laws, taxes, and political tensions that ultimately led to the American Revolution. It wasn't just a fight over freedom. It was a fight over control of global trade. When textbooks reduced the revolution to simple slogans like taxation without representation, they erased the deeper economic struggles that drove wealthy colonial leaders to resist British control. These leaders weren't just fighting for liberty. Many were protecting their financial interests, trade profits, land ownership, and economic autonomy. Immigrant labor played another major role in the rise of America, and yet this part of the story is also simplified in schools. Waves of immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, China, and other regions didn't just come to join society, they built it. They constructed railroads, dug canals, built cities, worked mines, opened shops, farmed new lands, and contributed technical skills from their home countries. But instead of being celebrated, many faced intense discrimination, violence, and exploitation. Chinese immigrants built the backbone of the Transcontinental Railroad, one of the most important infrastructures in American history. Yet their contribution was minimized for generations. The Irish escaped starvation, only to be met with signs saying, "No Irish need apply." German communities brought farming innovations that transformed agriculture. Italians shaped construction and food industries. Every wave of immigration brought knowledge, labor, and culture that strengthened the country. But schoolbooks often summarize this complex reality in a single line, if they mention it at all. The truth is that America's success came from countless hands and minds, most of which never made it into the history books. Another hidden force behind America's rise was the economic system built on slavery. It wasn't simply a moral wrong, it was an economic engine. The cotton produced by enslaved Africans fed factories in Britain and the northern United States. The profits from this system funded banks, shipping companies, insurance firms, railroads, and industries that still exist today. The wealth that slavery generated didn't stay in the South. It spread across the entire economy, building cities and fueling industrial growth. Textbooks often treat slavery as a Southern issue, but the entire nation benefited from it. Northern mills processed cotton, northern ships transported it, northern financiers insured it, and the global economy relied on it. This economic dependency on forced labor was one of the biggest hidden forces shaping early America. When slavery was eventually abolished, it wasn't just a moral shift. It was a massive economic shock that forced America to reinvent its entire labor system. Beyond the economic forces, America's rise was also shaped by political strategies rarely mentioned in school. Land companies pushed westward expansion not for freedom but for profit. The government encouraged settlers to move west because it wanted to outnumber native nations and European competitors. Every treaty, every land deal, every war was influenced by geopolitical motives. Even the Louisiana Purchase, which is taught as a simple act of expansion, was actually a complex global negotiation involving France's failed empire in the Caribbean and Napoleon's financial desperation. Nothing happened in isolation. Everything was part of a larger web of global politics. Another important but rarely discussed factor is how America used wars around the world to strengthen its own position. Long before World War II, the United States was supplying other countries with weapons, food, and materials. During World War I, Europe was too busy fighting to maintain its industries, and America stepped in to fill the gap. When the war ended, the US found itself with huge economic power and a strong global reputation. Even the Great Depression, despite its devastation, led to innovations in finance, social programs, infrastructure, and industry that later helped America outcompete other nations. When you look at all these hidden forces, global rivalries, trade systems, immigration waves, economic strategies, wars, land expansion, and political deals, you start to see that America's rise wasn't a simple heroic climb. It was a complex, messy, interconnected series of events shaped by decisions big and small, by people known and unknown, by motives noble and selfish. Schools often present history as a clean story because it's easier to teach. But the real story of America's rise is far more fascinating, far more complicated, and far more human. When most people think about the history of America, they think about freedom, opportunity, and growth. We hear about brave leaders, about presidents, about wars for independence, and about economic triumphs. But if you want to truly understand the foundation of America, you need to look at a truth that is rarely taught in schools. Slavery and racial injustice were not just unfortunate chapters in American history. They were central to the creation of the nation's economy and its global power. From the earliest colonies through the industrial age, enslaved Africans and their descendants generated immense wealth for a country that profited from their labor while systematically denying them basic human rights. Textbooks often reduce slavery to a moral wrong or a sectional problem, something confined to the South, when in reality it was the backbone of the nation's growth in almost every region. The cotton fields of the South didn't just produce raw materials, they fed the textile mills of the North and Europe, making entire industries dependent on the exploitation of human beings. Banks, shipping companies, insurance firms, and even early investment markets thrived on the profits derived from slavery. The wealth generated by this system didn't just disappear. It funded infrastructure, urban development, and institutions that became pillars of the modern American economy. In other words, slavery wasn't a side note in history. It was a central, driving force in building the nation, and yet this is often softened or overlooked in conventional teaching. The consequences of slavery extended far beyond economics. Families were torn apart, cultures disrupted, and entire generations were forced into a system of oppression that denied them education, freedom, and dignity. Enslaved people were not just workers. They were skilled, creative, and resilient individuals whose labor underpinned industries and wealth for people who rarely recognized their contributions. Many northern businesses, often celebrated for their industrial innovation, were deeply connected to slavery. Ships transporting cotton, insurance policies covering enslaved people, factories turning raw materials into products. All of these benefited directly from the institution of slavery. Even cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, which are sometimes viewed as distant from southern plantations, owe parts of their early economic power to the profits generated by forced labor. By ignoring these connections, history books create an incomplete picture, one that downplays the systemic nature of the economic advantages derived from exploitation. After the abolition of slavery, the struggle didn't end. In fact, new systems emerged that continued to exploit African Americans while maintaining the appearance of freedom. The post-Civil War era saw the rise of black codes, and later, Jim Crow laws, which restricted the rights and mobility of black citizens, keeping them in economic dependency and social subordination. Convict leasing became another method of forced labor, where black people could be arrested on minor or fabricated charges and then leased to companies for labor. Railroads, mines, factories, and plantations used this system extensively, creating a cycle of exploitation that continued well into the 20th century. These practices weren't hidden in isolated areas. They were widespread and supported by governments, law enforcement, and the legal system. Despite this, many history books barely mention them, focusing instead on political milestones or key leaders while leaving out the harsh realities faced by everyday people who bore the brunt of systemic oppression. Understanding this reality is critical because it shows that America's economic rise was tied not only to innovation and labor, but also to structural injustice, and that the legacies of slavery are deeply embedded in the nation's wealth and institutions. The cultural impact of slavery was also profound. African Americans contributed significantly to the arts, music, language, and knowledge of the nation, even under extreme oppression. Spirituals, folk songs, and storytelling preserved histories, beliefs, and experiences that were often ignored by mainstream culture. Many modern American cultural traditions, from jazz to blues, trace their roots to African heritage and the lived experiences of enslaved people. But schools rarely highlight the direct connection between these contributions and the forced conditions that made them necessary. By sanitizing history, the role of African Americans in shaping the nation's identity is often minimized, creating a distorted view that America's growth was independent of racialized labor and cultural contribution. It's also important to consider the political influence of slavery. Southern states, whose economies were heavily reliant on enslaved labor, held disproportionate power in Congress because of systems like the Three-Fifths Compromise, which counted enslaved people as partial representation for legislative purposes. This meant that the voices of white slaveholders carried more political weight than they would have based on population alone, allowing them to protect and expand the institution of slavery for decades. Northern leaders, often portrayed as morally opposed to slavery, frequently compromised or participated in economic systems tied to slavery in order to maintain political and financial stability. The struggle over slavery was never purely moral. It was also a question of power, wealth, and national strategy. These political dynamics shaped laws, policies, and social structures that influenced the entire country. Yet schools often present this history as a simple conflict between free and enslaved states, glossing over the complexity of economic, social, and political interdependence that made slavery central to America's development. The long-term effects of slavery also influenced migration and urban development. After emancipation, African Americans were often denied land and economic opportunities in the South, leading to the Great Migration, where millions moved north to cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York. They contributed massively to industrial labor, cultural movements, and urban growth. Yet they faced discrimination, segregation, and violence in these new environments. Their labor fueled factories, built neighborhoods, and drove economic growth, while their communities were systematically marginalized. These realities are rarely presented in depth in standard textbooks, but they are essential to understanding the full story of how America's economy and cities developed, and how systemic inequalities continue to shape opportunities today. Understanding the role of slavery also reframes how we think about American ideals like freedom, opportunity, and equality. The wealth created through exploitation funded education, infrastructure, innovation, and even cultural institutions, but it often excluded entire populations from enjoying these benefits. America's economic development and global influence were not simply the result of democracy or hard work. They were also deeply connected to systems that denied freedom and opportunity to millions of people. By acknowledging this, we can see how progress and injustice existed side by side, and how the legacies of the past continue to influence society in ways that textbooks rarely fully explain. Slavery and racial injustice were not minor elements in American history. They were central to the nation's growth, shaping economics, culture, politics, and society in profound ways. They reveal that the story of America is not just about heroes, inventions, and triumphs, but also about exploitation, resilience, and survival under systemic oppression. To truly understand the rise of the United States, one must recognize how the labor, knowledge, and contributions of African Americans, both enslaved and free, built the nation's wealth and influenced its trajectory, and how the systems of racial injustice persisted long after slavery officially ended. When most people think about how America became a superpower, they imagine it happening almost overnight, as if after World War II, the country suddenly leapt into global dominance. The truth is far more complex, and understanding this slow, strategic rise is key to appreciating how the United States became the nation we know today. Long before the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or before the United Nations was established, the United States had already been steadily building the foundations of power through careful planning, economic growth, industrialization, and participation in global affairs. The notion that America was isolated or passive before the mid-20th century is misleading. In fact, the country's rise to influence was gradual, deliberate, and deeply intertwined with global events. To understand this, you have to look at the decades leading up to World War II, starting with the late 19th century when the Industrial Revolution had already transformed the nation. Factories were booming, railroads were connecting the coasts, steel production was skyrocketing, and the U.S. was becoming a manufacturing giant capable of producing goods on a scale unmatched by most of Europe. This industrial might created economic strength, but it also positioned America to respond to global crises in ways other countries could not, giving it leverage that few Americans at the time fully understood. Even before entering global conflicts, the United States played a crucial role in shaping the world economy. During World War I, Europe was engulfed in war and could not produce the food, weapons, and materials needed to sustain itself. America stepped in, supplying food to starving populations, manufacturing weapons and munitions, and exporting essential goods on an unprecedented scale. This participation, though initially neutral, allowed the U.S. to establish itself as a central hub of global trade and finance. Banks in New York and other cities became critical for international transactions, while American businesses profited enormously from exports. By the time the war ended, the United States had shifted from a relatively regional power to a country with considerable influence on the global stage, a reality that textbooks often skip over or condense into a few sentences. This slow build-up, happening over years, demonstrates that America's superpower status was not accidental. It was the result of sustained economic growth, strategic positioning, and participation in world affairs long before the dramatic moments of World War II. Industrialization and technological innovation were also critical. America's ability to produce massive quantities of steel, coal, and machinery created an infrastructure that allowed the nation to respond quickly to global needs. Innovations in electricity, transportation, and communication connected cities and industries in ways that Europe, recovering from the devastation of war, could not immediately match. This internal development created the capacity for large-scale military production, urbanization, and economic expansion. The country's geographic size, combined with abundant natural resources, gave it advantages that other nations lacked. But these advantages only became meaningful when paired with the right policies, investments, and strategic planning. The United States didn't simply inherit these resources. It systematically developed the means to turn them into power, and it did so quietly, often unnoticed by the rest of the world, until crises revealed its potential. Political strategy also played a critical role. American leaders recognized that involvement in global affairs, when done carefully, could maximize influence without unnecessary risk. During the interwar period, the U.S. maintained a position of selective engagement, providing loans, trade, and support to allies while avoiding direct military entanglements until necessary. This approach allowed the country to benefit economically from Europe's instability and to emerge from global conflicts in a position of relative strength. The interplay between cautious diplomacy and economic intervention is often left out of simplified history lessons, which focus on major wars and treaties rather than the continuous strategic positioning that actually built American influence over decades. By shaping global markets, providing critical resources, and using economic leverage, the U.S. was able to expand its soft power, making it a central player in world affairs before anyone realized the full extent of its potential. Even domestic developments were part of this rise. The expansion of infrastructure, the growth of cities, and the modernization of agriculture created internal stability that supported external influence. Railroads connected distant regions, allowing for the rapid movement of goods and people. New technologies increased productivity and allowed industries to scale quickly. Education and professional training grew, creating a skilled workforce capable of supporting innovation and administration. These internal improvements meant that when international crises demanded action, the U.S. could mobilize faster and more effectively than many of its European counterparts. The combination of domestic strength, strategic economic engagement, and calculated diplomacy created the conditions for the country to emerge as a superpower, not suddenly, but gradually over decades of deliberate development. America's involvement in global conflicts further accelerated its rise. Participation in World War I demonstrated the country's industrial capacity and its ability to influence outcomes without committing to long-term occupation. The economic boom that followed positioned U.S. banks and corporations as key players in global finance. The interwar years, though often characterized by isolationist sentiment, were actually a time when America quietly expanded its reach, investing in international markets, stabilizing economies, and preparing infrastructure for future conflicts. By the time World War II erupted, the United States had the economic, industrial, and political tools to take a central role in shaping the post-war world. The war itself accelerated this rise, but the groundwork had been laid long before bombs were dropped. Factories shifted to military production, and soldiers were deployed abroad. This illustrates an important truth. Superpowers are not created overnight. They are cultivated over time through careful management of resources, strategic decision-making, and adaptation to global events. The rise of America also depended on social and cultural factors that textbooks often overlook. Immigration provided labor, talent, and innovation. Millions of people arriving from Europe and Asia contributed to industrial development, scientific discoveries, and urban growth. Their efforts created the human capital needed to support the nation's expansion and global influence. Meanwhile, domestic migration, such as the movement to the industrial north or to new agricultural lands, helped redistribute populations, skills, and resources in ways that supported economic growth and social mobility. These demographic shifts, combined with technological and economic progress, created a society capable of sustaining long-term power, even as challenges and inequalities persisted. Finally, understanding the United States' rise as a superpower requires acknowledging that it was not a linear or inevitable process. Crises like the Great Depression, social unrest, labor strikes, and political conflicts could have derailed growth. Yet, through innovation, adaptation, and strategic decision-making, the nation turned obstacles into opportunities. Policies supporting industrial expansion, investment in infrastructure, participation in global finance, and careful diplomatic engagement all contributed to the steady ascent that made America a dominant force by the mid-20th century. This rise was not sudden, dramatic, or accidental. It was gradual, deliberate, and the result of decades of decisions, actions, and strategies that positioned the United States to take center stage in the world. A story often compressed into a few pages in school textbooks that fail to capture the full scope of preparation, planning, and effort behind the emergence of a global superpower. When people study American history, they often focus on presidents, generals, lawmakers, and a few famous figures whose names are carved into monuments and textbooks. But if you look closely at the story of the nation, you realize something critical. The real history of America is not about a few iconic individuals. It is about millions of ordinary people whose decisions, labor, and creativity shaped the country in ways that textbooks rarely acknowledge. Farmers, craftsmen, laborers, immigrants, mothers, inventors, activists, soldiers, and countless others. These are the people whose actions determined the course of the nation, yet they remain largely invisible in conventional histories. This is one of the biggest untold truths about America, that it was built not by heroes alone, but by the collective effort of ordinary individuals, many of whom faced immense challenges, risks, and oppression. Understanding this changes the way we view the nation and its history, because it shows that America's strength has always come from the people, not just the leaders at the top. Take, for example, the early settlers who moved to the colonies. We often hear about the Pilgrims and their journey to freedom, but what textbooks don't tell us is how ordinary families struggled to survive in harsh, unfamiliar conditions. They built homes from scratch, cleared land for farming, hunted and fished for food, and battled disease and extreme weather. Many of them died young, and those who survived relied not on famous leaders but on each other for survival. The communities they built laid the groundwork for towns, trade networks, and local governance. And these small acts of resilience and ingenuity were foundational to America's growth. The larger narrative of independence and revolution is compelling, but it only happened because thousands of ordinary people contributed labor, ideas, and courage in ways that were never celebrated in history classes. Immigrants offer another striking example of how ordinary people shaped the nation. Millions arrived on America's shores with little more than hope and determination. Germans, Irish, Italians, Chinese, and others brought skills, traditions, and knowledge that transformed the economy and culture. They built railroads, dug canals, worked in mines, opened businesses, and farmed new lands, often under grueling conditions. While history may highlight a few industrial leaders or inventors, the reality is that these immigrants created the foundation for America's infrastructure and industry. The skyscrapers, roads, railways, and factories that symbolized progress would not have been possible without their labor and perseverance. Their stories are largely absent from standard textbooks, but their contributions were vital to the nation's development and remain a central part of the untold history. Laborers in cities also played a critical role in shaping America. Factory workers, construction crews, and miners worked long hours for low pay, often in dangerous conditions, building the economic and industrial base of the country. Strikes, protests, and demands for better conditions shaped labor laws and unions, influencing the rights and protections that workers enjoy today. These ordinary people were not famous. Their names are rarely recorded in history books. Yet, without their courage and persistence, America's rapid industrialization would have been impossible. They were the engine that drove economic expansion, and their stories reveal how collective effort and perseverance can shape a nation as profoundly as political decisions. The contributions of women in shaping the nation are another overlooked aspect of America's history. While presidents and political figures dominate textbooks, millions of women worked tirelessly in households, farms, factories, and community organizations to sustain families and communities. They provided education to children, organized social and religious institutions, cared for the sick, and participated in reform movements. During wars, women took on roles that men traditionally held, running businesses, working in factories, and supporting military efforts. Activists fought for women's suffrage, labor rights, and social justice, transforming society through persistence and advocacy. Even when their names were rarely recognized, their impact was enormous. These stories illustrate that history is not only shaped in the halls of government, but also in the lives and work of ordinary people whose efforts ripple through generations. Inventors, craftsmen, and innovators also played an enormous role in shaping America, often without recognition. From the bicycle mechanics who built the first airplanes to immigrant artisans who designed machines and tools, countless ordinary people contributed to the country's technological and industrial advancement. Many of these individuals worked in obscurity, yet their creativity and problem-solving skills enabled inventions that transformed the nation's economy, transportation, and communication. The narrative of a few great men inventing breakthroughs is incomplete. America's progress depended on the collective ingenuity of countless individuals, each adding pieces to the puzzle that became the modern nation. Communities themselves shaped the nation in profound ways. Local traditions, cooperative farming, trade networks, mutual aid societies, and cultural practices provided the social fabric that held early settlements together. Native Americans, African Americans, and immigrant communities Each contributed knowledge, practices, and resilience that influenced the broader culture and economy. These communities often faced enormous adversity, including displacement, discrimination, and violence, yet they persisted, adapted, and thrived. Their influence is embedded in agriculture, commerce, arts, cuisine, language, and political organization. Recognizing these contributions shifts our understanding of history from a story dominated by elites to a story of collective effort and ingenuity. Even during wars and revolutions, ordinary people determined outcomes in ways that often go unnoticed. Soldiers who fought in the Revolution or Civil War risked their lives without guarantee of reward or recognition. Local militias, laborers supplying armies, and civilians supporting logistical efforts all played roles critical to success. The bravery of these individuals was not always celebrated, yet without them, major historical events could have turned out very differently. Similarly, during social movements such as civil rights campaigns, millions of people, students, activists, workers, and ordinary citizens, organized, protested, and risked safety to demand change. Their collective action reshaped society far more than any single leader could alone. This focus on ordinary people also changes the way we understand national achievements. Infrastructure, education systems, public services, and cultural institutions are all products of collaborative effort. America's growth was not handed down by a few exceptional leaders. It was built brick by brick, idea by idea, and action by countless individuals whose efforts were interconnected across regions, classes, and generations. The persistence, resilience, and creativity of these people turned challenges into opportunities, disasters into rebuilding efforts, and ideas into innovations that defined the nation. History textbooks often present a simplified narrative that emphasizes famous figures. Yet the true story is far more human, complex, and inspiring because it reveals the power of ordinary people to shape extraordinary outcomes. By understanding that America was built by the actions of millions, we also see the importance of agency in history. Decisions made by everyday people, how they worked, protested, built, migrated, or innovated, directly influenced the trajectory of the nation. America's successes and failures are inseparable from the lives of ordinary individuals, whose stories are rarely told in classrooms. Recognizing this not only provides a more complete view of history, but it also offers lessons for today. Ordinary people have the power to create change, to influence societies, and to shape the future, just as they did throughout America's history.